Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, the editor at covertactionmagazine.com. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He has what is one of my favorite websites on the internet, and that is covertactionmagazine.com. We're going to talk about some great articles that he has there. And just so you know, look this. On the site, they've got various series: 9/11 attacks, Biden series, Israel Gaza war, political assassinations, prison industrial complex, war in Ukraine, a lot of stuff. They cover a lot on things on covert action, CIA, MI6, you name it. So it is an outstanding website, and I recommend that to everybody. One of the best if you want to find out what the heck's going on. Now, as we see presidents continually do things, especially regarding Israel, that seem, shall we say, perplexing, we may have some answers. Here's a great article. Were Donald Trump and Bill Clinton blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein working for Israeli intelligence? Well, I'll answer it like this. Of course they were. But let's, in my humble opinion, but let's talk with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov and get the details. Trump, Clinton, Epstein. Sounds plausible. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, this is an article. I think the author is Kathleen Meigs, and she has, evidence that Epstein, I think, was, clearly more and more people are coming to understand that this was an intelligence operation. I mean, there is a long pattern of this. These kind of honey traps. The CIA has been involved with that for several generations. In fact, I was doing some research the other day, and this woman named Mae Brussel, who was a radio host back in the 70s, and she was discussing, she would research the CIA and the so-called deep state, and she was discussing how Howard Hughes, in Las Vegas, he owned a lot of casinos, and they had cameras everywhere. He was working with the CIA, and they would have cameras in Las Vegas to capture certain bad behavior that they could use over people, powerful people. And that's just one example. And Bobby Baker, she was also discussing, was a Senate aide to Lyndon Johnson, and he set up he was involved with a prostitution ring that would basically bring senators, set them up with call girls in Washington, and that was also a honey trap. They would use it for I think the Johnson would use it for blackmail to serve his own political objectives. And then Hoover was involved in those kind of Johnson and Hoover were best friends, so they lived next to each other in Washington. I think Hoover was all over that too, and they used the tapes. I mean, I think they blackmailed the Kennedys. Brussel commented a lot about that, and that all the Kennedys were blackmailed, and that's one reason some of the younger Kennedys may not have taken up the JFK assassination investigation, like Ted Kennedy. They had so much goods over him that they kind of kept him in check on that issue, as well as other things. So this is a long-standing practice of U.S. intelligence and so-called deep state. So what we see here is just a continuity, and the Israelis have gotten the game as well. And I mean that's one theory about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is that the reason he was adopting some progressive positions, including on the Ukraine, but then when Israel started attacking and brutalizing the Gazans, and most of his supporters were against that, a lot of them at least, but he refused to condemn that, and he was actually supporting Israeli policy, and a lot of people quit. At one point, I even was doing some articles for the Kennedy Beacon, and there were a lot of progressive people doing some work on that. But after the Israel, they just left because it was ridiculous, the position he was taking. But that was a theory that they had blackmail on him. So, um, I think it's a standard practice, and the Israelis are in the game now, and they may use this over various political figures to get what they want out of them. And it's gone real far because I mean, what the Israelis have done in Gaza is just unconscionable. I'm at a conference this week in San Francisco on the Pacific War, and a lot of the panels focused on the Japanese invasion of China, and we heard like some really moving stuff from family members, how it impacted them even several generations later. The horrific atrocities that Japan committed in China when they invaded in 1937, and the rape of Nanking. But it's similar, unfortunately, to what I think the United States did in Vietnam, and now it's going on in Gaza. Horrific crimes, and I think it's going to affect generations of people, Gazans, but also because one of the speakers was a Japanese whose father was a soldier in Manchuria and committed all these atrocities. And he was discussing how it impacted his family. His father came back, and he was a different person, and it was a guilt he felt, and a pain, and he kind of lost his humanity in China. And then he became alcoholic, and it affected their family life, and there was a lot of guilt in the family and kind of suppressed emotions. And I think we're going to see that an Israeli side now, with the horrible thing they've done. You can't escape the guilt for that, and people will be impacted. Maybe today they believe in the propaganda. It's the same kind of propaganda. What I was seeing at the conference is that the Japanese just thoroughly dehumanized the Chinese, made them to be less than human, and those are the kind of statements we're seeing from Israeli officials about Palestinians, calling them human animals. Marco Rubio said something the other day, "Oh, these are barbaric animals," and when you hear that rhetoric, that is the rhetoric of genocide. And I mean, maybe now people are kind of who are involved in these criminal operations maybe believe the propaganda, but as time goes on, they're going to feel that guilt, and they're in a way victims too. Not to take agency away from their criminal actions, but their lives will be adversely affected as well as those of their families. So the weight of this is just terrible. And it's similar in Indochina, generations removed. There's still kids being killed from bombs that were dropped by the United States in Indochina, and people are still suffering today from idiotic decisions made 50, 60 years ago. So it's a horror show, but again, yeah, some of it may be just the blackmail, as we say. Some of these politicians have been compromised because of their decadent personal lives, and that's how the game is played out in the intelligence world.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think that's interesting, and that is if you look at the Trump and Clinton thing, there are people who support Trump or Clinton and anything bad about them or anything that seems to be compromised about them because they like the person or they support the person. They don't want to believe it. And they'll just say, these are the political enemies. Hunter Biden came out a while back and said, well, Epstein introduced Melania to Trump. And of course, a lot of people who were Trump supporters, that's just, liberals of the Bidens or whatever. But there seems to be some substance to that, doesn't there?
Well, I think so. It's like a tight knit, ruling elite. I mean, I think they want to divide the population and have liberals hate Democrats, but really, sorry, liberals hate Republicans. But I think really the divide in our society is between the population at large versus this narrow clique of elites. And America is supposed to be a democracy, but really it's an oligarchy run by these elite families and billionaire class, and they're all kind of tight with each other. You saw that there was a photo a while back, not too long ago. It was, I forget whose funeral, where Obama and Trump were like laughing, and they're all laughing because like they have no morality, and they just want more and more for themselves, more money, more mansions, more sex, including often with underage girls, and they just live the high life, and they have no morality whatsoever, and they're very clubbish and cliquish among each other, and they're screwing over the public. We've discussed at length before on the show the kind of policy they're adapting are not in the public interest. They're spending billions and billions on more now, $1 trillion a year budget on warfare. On these, Trump had this ludicrous. He wants to revive the Reagan Star Wars initiative. He's bringing in Canada. It's corrupting Canada. They're spending ever more on the military, and meanwhile, the cost of living for all of us is going up. Wages are going down. Investment education is going down. The healthcare, we don't have we should have a free healthcare system in the United States. We don't. The infrastructure dilapidated. The homeless population is getting way out of control. The city don't know what to do with it. Now they're rounding up homeless. It's more and more authoritarian methods that we're experiencing, including the occupation of Washington, D.C. So, I mean, we're just, dealing with worse and worse policies. And these guys are just smiling all the way that the bank or their next sex escapade with minors, and they're just vile human beings. And it's similar like in the Middle Ages. If you study medieval history, you find that you just have some decadent leaders at the top, and that's what we're at now. We're moving toward like a feudal structure, and that's why we need popular movements for change. But what they're trying to do is divide and conquer, and that's why they're really fueling these partisan hatred and divisions. And that's a dangerous game they're playing. But the more that can see through it, the more we can build together a progressive movement to try and restore some semblance of democracy.
One of the other things I think that's interesting, and that's again in this story about Trump and Clinton being blackmailed, and that is you always think of they're blackmailing the American, but in this article they talk about Ehud Barak, that they had stuff on him that he was blackmailed. You think about, okay, they're blackmailing the American, but if people didn't never stop to think, well, look, Israel has presidents, has leaders who may say, you know what, we'll make a deal with the U.S. regarding something that the Israeli special operations, the Israeli right wing, whatever, the Israeli settlers might not like. And that not only were they blackmailing likely U.S. presidents, Ehud Barak was likely blackmailed also. They probably likely had compromise on him. And they were likely even involved in setting up or people or assassination, such as possibly even JFK.
Yeah, well, with the Israelis, I think these are the dirty tactics of the far right, because they're advancing policy that are in nobody's interest, and that lead to endless and permanent war. And there were Israeli politicians who wanted to establish a peace agreement with the Palestinian. There was a pretty wide support for many years in Israel, and that really would be a pathway to real Israeli security. But the far right agenda is just to crush the Palestinians and create a greater Israel, which entailed basically permanent warfare against Israeli neighbors. And so they have to use blackmail. I mean, they were popular politicians. Well, they had to assassinate. Yitzhak Rabin had been kind of a hardliner who was a military commander in the Six-Day War, but he was moving towards, and they were imperfect, the Oslo Accords, Oslo 1, Oslo 2. But, he was at least negotiating and willing to make certain concessions in the name of peace. And boom, they assassinate him. Then you have other figures like, Ehud Barak, who is also continuing, who's more in that vein of Rabin. And as you say, there's strong evidence he was blackmailed, and they forced him to backtrack on any concession with the Palestinians, and ultimately he was defeated, and the far right was able to advance its agenda. So the consequence for society of these kind of methods that they use are horrific, as we're seeing playing out now. And this war in Gaza, obviously horrific for the Gazans and Palestinians, but it's ruining Israeli society as well. It's affecting their economy, their moral fabric. I mean, they're a pariah nation now, and these kind of rule by force is not a way to gain security for your country, because you made more and more enemies, and they'll seek retribution. So this has been a disaster for Israelis, for Jews, and of course for Gazans and Palestinians. So these methods, it's the just sewer of humanity. They use the most dirty methods to advance their aims, which are very bad ones, and just serve a narrow. I mean, there's offshore oil. I think this is, underlying this is the goal of certain oil companies and Israeli profiteers to access the oil offshore and to try and develop Gaza, with luxury hotels, and make a fortune off it. And that's really their interest. So they have no regard for humanity, and they use these dirty methods to try and get their way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that what we're looking at now is something that's been going on for years, and the Epstein issue has kind of opened people's eyes to, not just to me, not just the depravity, dealing with young children, or really anything that needed to be done. It doesn't matter, child trafficking, sexual trafficking, you name it. But we see that in this particular article, they talk about the fact that Epstein would meet beautiful women because these rich politicians and people needed trophy wives. He'd meet beautiful women. He'd kind of have them bring or meet them or have them, in his group, whether they were spies or whatever the case may be, associates. Then you're some rich guy, powerful guy. He introduces you to a trophy wife. Here you go. He introduces you to this beautiful trophy wife. But now, I put it to you like this. When I was in law enforcement, one of the things that I knew was this: if you want to know, when I worked at headquarters. Of course, I was a part of the command staff. But here's what I knew: where do you get all the information? From the secretaries, the superintendent secretary, the other mate. I was good friends with all of the secretaries in there and talked to them regularly. Why? Because when the superintendent or other majors or lieutenant colonels talking on the phone, they're in the room, they don't even count the secretary. So they say everything that they don't want to get out in front of all their secretaries. The secretaries know everything. So I'd ask them, hey, or they come to me, hey, Garland, the superintendent's going to do this, or that. What? Yeah, he was talking to the governor on the phone the other day, and he said, blah, 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 blah. I knew everything, right? That was the key. So my point being, if Epstein is introducing these trophy wives to these people and he keeps in touch with them, the guy doesn't stop to think, well, my wife's going to send the information to other people. So you couldn't get closer to a guy than introducing him to the trophy wife. So when you look at it, this thing was so in depth. They had it so well thought out that they could get people right up, as they say in football, up against the numbers, right? They could have somebody right there, and the guy does everything. People can't. I've got a phone, and it's a secure phone and satellite. I got everything around, but little does he realize his wife's next to him, and she can transmit information that he would never stop to think. She's having children by him, everything, but he doesn't stop to think. That is a vulnerability, and it appears from what I'm seeing that was one of the angles that they took here.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just a way to buy loyalty, I mean, the guy's grateful. He's brought them this beautiful wife. He's going to do everything for that they ask. They just want one small favor in return, and he's going to do it. So they have their methods, yeah, for securing the loyalty of people, or as you say, using that woman to get information from him as a spy, because he doesn't suspect her, and she knows everything. So you're absolutely right. They
Well,
figured it all out. Yeah.
if you look at the whole Kennedys, it seems to me they were a threat, Because if you look at JFK, there's a lot of speculation and some information, then statements that have been made pointing to potentially the connection between the Israeli intelligence and his death. RFK Jr., well, Sirhan, and the whole thing about him saying that it was the Palestinians, the narrative at least is connected to the Israeli conflict. Whether we know all the suspicious things happen, and we know it's obviously intelligence, because it couldn't have possibly happened the way we were told with the RFK assassination. Then you go to Ted Kennedy, the whole Chappaquiddick thing. Well, there's been a lot written on that it appears certainly that there was some suspicious activity there that could have involved, and likely maybe even did involve, intelligence. You go to JFK Jr., his airplane going down, when he started to say, I'm going to look into how my father was killed, and all of a sudden his airplane goes down in very suspicious circumstances that don't make sense, right? When you look all through the Kennedys, you say it appears that every unfortunate incident that happened to one of the Kennedys is so suspicious that it looks like there was intelligence involved. And you could likely maybe even relate it. Look at RFK Jr. that was doing a lot of things that I thought that needs to be done. And then all of a sudden, when the Gaza conflict thing fires up, he does a 180, and everybody's like, that is not aligned with what you've been saying. That seems weird. So it seems to me that the whole Kennedy family has been targeted for years by intelligence, whether it's CIA, Mossad, or some MI6, some combination of all of the above. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah. And with the Chappaquiddick guy, I've looked into that more, and it's clear Teddy Kennedy was set up there. The forensic evidence made clear that he could not have, because for those who aren't aware of that incident, and it was the year when Kennedy was going to run for president, and the year I think the next year it was around 1970, and the 72 election was coming up, and he was coming up as the heir of the Kennedy dynasty. And he had, the Kennedys were more liberal, so that they can attract the kind of, in that area, still had the 60s movements. So he can attract remnants of the 60s movements. And he was a very strong candidate. He would have done much better in the 72 election than George McGovern, and had a chance to defeat Nixon. So they couldn't allow that. And so but they couldn't murder another candidate, because that would look like, I mean, they were trying to carry out put forward the illusion that these were lone nut assassins who killed John and Robert. But then if a third Kennedy was killed by another lone nut, I mean, everybody would say, oh, there's a pattern here. So they got creative, and they set them up. And the official story was he got drunk, and he was having an affair with a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, who had worked for Robert Kennedy, and that he drove his car off the pier into the water off Cape Cod, and then somehow he escaped the car and swam a long distance where the poor girl died. But in fact, firstly, it was impossible. They said only like an Olympic swimmer might have made it. And he had, after a night of drinking, no man could have swum the distance he did, including some people who investigated this looked at the current and the tide, and they said, no, it couldn't. Maybe an Olympic swimmer at his peak, but not a guy after a night of drinking. And Ted was not an Olympic swimmer. So just that, but there's evidence that she, and then the skid marks in the car didn't match, and all kinds of forensic evidence made clear that somebody else, and actually her cause of death was asphyxiation, and also where she was found in the water in the back seat. Science experts said it's impossible, because she was supposed to be riding in the front seat. How did she make it in the back seat? And then it would have been impossible for Ted to have escaped the car. And then, the cause of death was found to be asphyxiation. So the evidence indicated she was killed before, and that they made up a story for Ted. They threatened him, and then they helped him get to safety, but or released him. They didn't kill him, but they set him up. And then there's a guy who came out and admitted what happened a couple years ago. He gave an interview, and he was this guy. I think his name is Fields, and I've seen the interview online, and he worked closely with Frank Sturgis, this Watergate plumber and CIA dirty workman. And he said that Sturgis was, told them exactly what to do, and he said what happened, that they killed Kopechny. They kind of roughed Ted up and kind of threatened him, but then told him exactly what to do and said, wait till the next morning, because he only called the next morning. He never called. And that was also suspicious. If there was a major accident, he didn't call for help right away. He only reported it like the next morning, but that's what he had been told to do. And, by these CIA people with Sturgis, and I think E. Howard Hunt was involved, and some of the classic CIA people linked with the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, and all kinds of other CIA shenanigans and crimes were involved in this too. So more evidence. There are a number of articles, and the evidence is pretty strong in this case. So just to go along with what you're saying, I think the Kennedys weren't saints. I mean, they were playboys, and they had a dark side of the family, so they can use this over them to get them in line. But they were a threat, yeah. And especially after JFK was killed, any other Kennedy is a threat to revive the investigation, which is known to be fraudulent, the Warren Commission. And so they can't have another Kennedy in the White House. So JFK Jr., the strong evidence his plane was sabotaged. And then RFK, he's, as you said, he's exhibited very odd behavior and odd position, inconsistent political positions, and that would be an indication that he's not an independent man, that somebody's has something over him and is coercing him on various issues. Even the COVID, he backtracked a lot on some of the original stuff he said, and he's not following through, which is not surprising.
Even I'll give you one that people forget about. Do you remember the mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry?
Mm-hmm.
You remember what happened to him?
They set him up for cocaine, right?
Yeah. Here's what happened. A woman who had, this is as apparently as I can understand it, a woman, beautiful woman, honeypot, right? A beautiful woman was in trouble for drugs. Of course, the FBI then gets her and sets her up in a hotel room. The FBI gives her crack cocaine and tells her to get him to smoke some of the crack cocaine. They did. It was like a classic. If you think about it, it was a classic Epstein thing. The FBI takes a woman who is in trouble, got for charges for crime, uses her. You go in a hotel. Here's some crack. They gave her the crack. Okay, get him in here and get him to smoke it. And they put cameras all around and cops, FBI guys in the next room. Lures him in there. He gets him to smoke the crack. Soon as they do that, they bust in and they arrest him. But they release all of the video almost immediately on TV. So I'm like, that is I don't know what it was. For whatever reason, they wanted to take him down. We'll probably never know. But I'm looking at it and I'm saying, wow, that's the Epstein. You can see that is their modus operandi. Get you in there, get a woman who's compromised, who has, charges hanging over her head, get a compromised woman, put her in there, beautiful woman at just the right age. You know what I mean? She wasn't too old. She wasn't too young for his age bracket, right? Put her in there. Here, smoke this crack. Soon as the second he smokes it, boom, go in there and get him. It was like the, perfect setup.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I think he was, adopting various progressive policies, and he was a popular figure. who came more out of the Black Power movement, from my understanding. I don't know that much about him, but that was my sense, that he was out of the '60s era movements,
He
and he
was
was
in
more.
the what was it, SNCC, the Students Nonviolent Coalition Commission. People don't know he was a smart guy. Do you know he was studying for his PhD in chemistry at the
Mhm.
time that he was with SNCC? And a brilliant person. Um,
Yeah,
and
very
ultimately,
progressive, and he was making some good changes as the mayor, and that's what they made him a threat.
and you know the interesting thing
And
about Marion.
a guy smokes crack. I mean, look, I mean, it's like people will go out to drink, have a bar, have a drink. I mean, it doesn't make them a bad person or ill qualified. Just because they indulge, once in a drug or something. I mean, almost every human has tried drugs at some point in their life, or they have a drink. I mean, it doesn't mean they're ill qualified as mayor.
Well, how
Like,
about
they make
this?
like that's the worst thing. He's the worst person because one time he tried this drug. Uh, I
And they
mean,
used a beautiful woman to entice them. And I'll add this. Here's what
yeah.
people don't know about Marion Barry, because I know people are very good friends with him. He never stole a dime. He never took bribe. When Marion Barry died, he lived in a poor area. He would never move out of that of DC in Ward 8. He lived and he didn't have hardly any money. And a lot of people who had gotten very rich in the city over the course of time would stop by and drop him off money and food. A lot of people loved him. He never used his position to enhance himself. So if he was so bad, he didn't. Why is it he died poor? He never used his money to get rich. I mean, never used his political position to get rich, right? So here's a guy who was he known to chase women? Sure, but he chased women that were like his age, that weren't like young girls or whatever. Did he chase women and drink and party and stuff? Sure, but that's not anything abnormal. But what he didn't do is enrich himself. And here's what I've always thought: there was something they wanted him to sign off on, something he wanted to do, some contract. We'll probably never know. He said no. He knew what it was, and when he didn't, that he had to go down. You know what I mean? They had to make an example out of him. But I'm looking at it later on. I thought, holy crap, that's classic honeypot stuff. That's what Epstein did all the time.
Hmm. Yeah, and that is the method of the so-called deep state and ruling class. And it may have been that, yeah, some of his policy were too progressive, and he was challenging certain, powerful business or economic interests. And especially if he was as popular as you say, he would have made it from mayor. He would have been soon elected to Congress, and could have even been a contender at the presidential level. So they don't want those kind of policies being implemented nationally that will challenge big business and actually make life better for people.
Yeah, one thing I'll say about what's interesting is they created this persona of him as some crazy madman, crackhead, drug addict, blah blah blah. But the people in DCA loved him because of his policies that like helped poor people a lot, um, helped build the middle class in the area. That's what he's known for. I mean, I know people that knew him. I know plenty of people from DC, and they're like, everybody there. When he ran again, they elected him again. Why? Because of his policies. But what was created was a persona of some crazy madman who was just out there. And I'm like, okay, a politician that parties and chases women. Boy, at least they were women, at least they weren't little girls, but bottom line is, to me, that's classic. That's what we're talking about. Now let's go on. Since we're here, there's another interesting article that you wrote. And it's for everybody. Go to covertactionmagazine.com. And here's something that came out recently that hit the news, but was quickly dropped. It just hit the news in the New York Times for whatever reason. Trump greenlit a deadly covert operation in 2019 that further poisoned U.S. North Korea relations. If you talk about that.
Yeah, and that was an important revelation. Yeah, and periodically we do get good reporting in the mainstream media. And this, yeah, exposed the covert operation. And perhaps because maybe the New York Times, they're anti-Trump, so they kind of this was something greenlit by Trump. it was a deadly covert operation, and these kind of covert operations, I think, have been going on for decades in North Korea. They tried to infiltrate a team of Navy SEALs into North Korea to plant spy and listening devices on the North Korean leader Kim Jong Un, and it turned deadly. It turned wrong because they were sneaking into North Korea via some underwater submarines. But I think as they emerged from the water, there was a fishing boat that was near them, and they panicked and they saw the boat that could possibly compromise their covert operations. So they fired on the boat and sadly killed 6 fishermen. And then they had to abort the mission and turn back. But it was because of that the North Korean authorities were alerted of this covert sabotage effort, and it further, I mean, if you look at things from their point of view, going back to the Korean War, firstly, the United States had bombed much of North Korea and devastated North Korea, killed thousands of civilians, and then ever since, the U.S. carried out a huge military buildup in South Korea and imposed devastating sanctions, and has been pushing regime change and threatening them with military invasion and carrying out these kind of covert sabotage and deadly covert operations. So imagine if that happened in the United States, a foreign country was carrying out these kind of covert operations and killed 6 American fishermen. It makes perfect sense that North Korea has to invest a huge amount in their military and in building up a nuclear weapon program. But the media makes it seem like they're just a threat and they're a rogue state, when they've been subjected to all this over years. And all because they adopted really the governing philosophy there is juche, or independent. Like they want to be a more independent nation economically, because historically Asian countries were exploited by Western powers, and it undermined their development. And it's really a very rational philosophy to want to have more independence. That's something we want in the United States. We don't want foreign powers, countries dominating our economy or owning our land. But because of their independence and their ties with the communist China, they've been the target of 80 years of regime change and war and covert operations. And the Democrats attacked Trump. The irony also, I note in the article, Democrats were attacking Trump. Oh, he's Kim Jong-un's best buddy and he's appeasing North Korea. That's the kind of rhetoric we saw at the Democratic Party convention this year. And Leon Panetta's speech and Kamala Harris's speech, they condemned Trump for appeasing Putin and Kim Jong-un. And yet Trump was basically continuing the past administration's policies. Yes, once he met with him, but nothing really concrete came out of that. And this further poisoned U.S., South Korean, North Korean relations. And now it's at a very tense. The article mentioned that after this incident, any positive relations broke down, and both sides are pursuing the kind of arms race. And it's very tense in the Koreas, and the demilitarized zone, from what's been described in various writings, is a very scary place. And they're the lingering threat of war, nuclear war, that Koreans have had to live with for generations. And the country is still tragically divided. I've been at events and met a lot of South Koreans, especially older South Koreans, have family in North Korea, and they want to be reunited with their family, but they can't. It's an artificial, and they've been divided for years, decades, and in some cases even parents were divided from their children. And the second half of that article I discussed, the Times feature, New York Times featured a guy who was a prisoner for 40 years. He was a North Korean soldier, and they captured him in the Korean War, and he was imprisoned for 40 years. And now he wants to go back. He's 95 years old, and he wants to go back to North Korea before he dies, because he doesn't have that much time left. but they won't allow him to. And like the Times was kind of mocking. It was rare that the New York Times actually featured, mainstream media featured the perspective of a North Korean soldier, and the article revealed horrific things. Like he described how his friend, he witnessed people in North Korea being struck by American napalm and burned to death in front of him, and that he'll never forget the women would cover their private parts as they were being like fried from napalm. They didn't want to, be exposed. And he saw these horrific things. So like you wonder, they make like he has like his worldview is a relic of the past, and yet he's describing the horrible thing the United States did during the Korean War, and then that he was in prison, he was taken prisoner, and they kept him for 40 years, not 4 years, 40
Wow.
years, and he was brutally tortured in South Korean prisons. Like he lost all his teeth, and like they beat him up, and just he was subjected to all forms of torture over a 40-year period. And then the New York Times is kind of like mocking him that he wants to go back to North Korea, and he has a worldview out of the Cold War, and times have changed, and South Koreans appreciate the United States. That's what the New York Times was saying at the end of the article. The reporting they did was very interesting, because we rarely hear this, and this is a window into how awful the Korean War was, and this is a forgotten war in American memory. It's never discussed. I don't think it's ever taught to students, maybe just the basics, facts, but never how horrible it was on the population, and how they suffered napalm, like what he was describing, napalm attacks, long-term imprisonment. And it's supposed to be, a lot of attention was given how the Chinese and North Koreans supposedly brainwashed American prisoners of war, but none were held after the war. They released them. Unlike this guy, had 40 more years, and most of his life was lost. Because
The other thing, and you and I have talked about it, and I think one of the reasons that the US government has done so much to hide what was going on and not to report on the Korean War is because there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the United States used various diseases, biological warfare, that was very, very widespread. There was widespread use of biological agents during the Korean War by the United States.
Yes, in fact, it's now been confirmed, and I have another article I can try and pull up that was written this year, based on a review of a book by Thomas Powell, whose father had been blacklisted in the McCarthy era and had investigated germ warfare. And actually, the book made clear that the CIA released some documents a couple years ago that unwittingly verified the use of germ warfare, because the CIA had denied for decades that they had used germ warfare, and they tried to claim that it was communist propaganda, and that there were 21 American pilots who were taken prisoner of war who confessed to germ warfare, but the CIA had claimed that they were brainwashed. Yeah, there it is. Uh, but now these documents, unwittingly, I think it was a younger agency staff who didn't know the whole history, released some documents in which the CIA was reporting on public health initiatives in China and North Korea to deal with the outbreak of diseases that had resulted from the germ warfare. They dropped pest-laden bomb. That's what the pilots had confessed to. And now the CIA released these documents reporting on public health initiatives taken by the Chinese and North Koreans. So that proved it, because it showed it was concrete reporting that they had to adopt public health measures to address real disease outbreaks. It was not invented, as the CIA had claimed for 70 years. And I tried to smear the CIA. The first to report on this was Thomas Powell's father, who had founded a magazine called China Monthly, and he was blacklisted under McCarthyism. They attacked him as a communist, and he couldn't work as a journalist. And he bought an antique shop and ran that. And then when he retired, he did some additional research. And there were other authors who they attacked who had exposed this. But now we know that's true. So it gets, yeah, I mean, the Korean War was just hideous. And they were using Japanese scientists who had carried out germ warfare in China, like General Shiro Ishii and the infamous Unit 731 of the Japanese Kwangtung Army that committed the horrific war crimes and medical experiments along with germ warfare. They recruited the head of that unit, General Shiro Ishii, and he actually secretly went to Korea to advise the U.S. military. And he worked at Fort Detrick, Maryland, with Dr. Frank Olson, who they murdered because he threatened to expose that in the 50s, what they were doing, and he was murdered. So, yeah, it's a very, very dark history, and it's a suppressed history before the public. But it's a horrific chapter in American history, and it's still playing out today because North Korea continues to be demonized and subjected to these deadly, continuously deadly covert operations, and these poor fishermen were just doing their daily work, and they had to get murdered for no reason at all, and they're the latest victims of this horrific foreign policy.
Well, I remember I went to this. I learned a lot. I went to this peace meeting at this in Philadelphia, and it was Korean people who were living here who still had family there, and they were very upset about it. And one of the things that I didn't realize, one of the things that they talked about, and we don't realize that what's going on. Americans don't understand that Korea is a colony of the U.S. empire. They don't have Korea doesn't really have any any individual ability to run its own country. That in the event, and they were talking about this, in the event of a war, the South Korean army comes under the United States. The United States controls the South Korean army of the war. That after they talked about life, some of the older ones talked about after World War II, the US put this like brutal dictators in charge. And South Korea was run for years by just absolutely brutal fascist dictators. And that and they were talking about even now in school, right? They were saying when you're in school, children, and they'll have classes and people teaching them, yes, the communists, they hate you. The North Koreans are evil. And they'll like indoctrinate the children with all of this anti-North Korea stuff and why they should hate the North Koreans. The North Koreans want to come across the border and kill them, etc. So the United States government still operates in South Korea and indoctrinates with all kinds of lies and propaganda the children from a very young age to be opposed to and afraid of the North Koreans, so they can always have them ready to go to war with North Korea, and always afraid North Korea is ready to attack us, only because the United States is protecting us. If it wasn't for that, then the North Koreans would be attacking us. And then they suppress when there are protests against the U.S. occupation of North Korea and U.S. bases. They suppress it violently, and then they make sure it doesn't get in the news.
Yeah, that's a good report, and I've studied that issue at some length, and I took courses on that topic. And yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying. And this article, yeah, see, they were mocking the New York Times, although again, the reporting was actually good. But then, like when they got into analysis, especially this article on this guy they started mocking him at the end of the article and saying like his views were out of date. And that was one thing they mocked him for, because he said, "Oh, South Korea is a U.S. colony." And On participated in a lot of base protests after he got out of prison, and they would say exactly what you're saying, that we're a colony. And this Times article did report his worldview, but kind of mocked it. But it is the reality. I mean, the U.S. Has 15 bases, I believe, in South Korea. They provide a huge amount of financial aid and support. And I think, yeah, South Korean leaders are constrained in what they can do, because they'll compromise the U.S. support. So I mean, they may adopt independent domestic policies, but when it comes to but if they took a strong stand against U.S. corporations, I don't think they would last long in power. And they don't. Yeah, same in foreign policy. They just go along with U.S. foreign policy designs, and it's a toxic climate. I hear what you're saying. Like they just totally demonize North Korea, and they're all evil communists, and they can't have any rational discussion about it or about the Korean War. Although ironically, when there was a more enlightened leader, like after in 1987, there was a democratic revolution, and one of the leaders was Kim Dae-jung, who had been imprisoned, I think, in the early 80s by one of these military dictatorships. But then he became the South Korean leader in the late 90s, and he had a more progressive approach. He was pushing the Sunshine Policy, and then he inaugurated the Truth Commission, which was a detailed study and investigation of the Korean War. And that Truth Commission found that 6 times, as far as the atrocities in the war, 6 times the South Korean army committed 6 times more atrocities than the North Korean army. Although if you read, because as a historian, I juxtaposed that with how the U.S. media had reported on the Korean War at the time. Like I went back and reviewed articles from the 1950s in the New York Times and Saturday Evening Post, and it was all about the Reds and the atrocities that they were committing and the communist evil barbarian, basically. And yet when the truth comes out, and a lot of the massacres they were reporting as communist massacres that we know now were actually South Korean soldier massacres. And with this Truth Commission, we know for a fact, again, 6 times. So that's a good exercise, like for students, to see how biased the media is and how it indoctrinates Americans as well as South Koreans, as you say, to hate the communists, think of them as evil, think they were. And when I ask students, in recovering this topic in my courses, they instinctively believe that the North Koreans were sadistic and committed most of the atrocities. And then I go over the Truth Commission findings, and it's like a real aha moment for them. Oh my God, it was actually our side that committed 6 times the atrocities. And that gets them thinking about the coverage of every other war. So it's a good exercise to do that. But yeah, it's sad. We have the same indoctrination as them. And even I think I've seen leftist intellectuals just like mocking North Korea as a standard of evil and a standard of bad government. But we've had some articles in Covert Action by people who've lived in North Korea, and they say it's just another country, and there are actually a lot of good things that go on in North Korea. Their governing philosophy makes a lot of sense in light of their history. And I mean, like every country, there are bad things about their government and it's authoritarian, but there are also good things that don't get reported. And it's much more of a mixed story than we're led to believe. So, and there's no reason now, all these years after the Korean War, we can't reestablish diplomatic relations and just end this senseless conflict. And that will be better for world security because there's no more North Korean nuclear threat, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll end by saying I remember a long time ago, this was in 1984. I watched a movie called The Killing Fields, and it was about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and all the terrible things that happened there. And then later on, I'm like, didn't we kill like 800,000 people in Cambodia from just bombing, villages? You know what I mean? It's like the United States, they claim 1.3 million people were killed. I don't know exactly what the number is, but it's like, oh, it's terrible what they did. And it is. But they left out that the U.S. killed 800,000 people. They left out that we killed like 3 million in Vietnam. You know what I mean? It's like we watch this Hollywood thing about, oh, isn't it terrible what this group over here did? And we leave out I mean, I don't even have to begin, but I could go on and on and on to what we did from the Philippines to Indonesia to, just a field of blood from one end of this earth to the other that the US empire was involved in. And then we make a movie. Look what this group did here. It's terrible, as though we're like appalled by it.
Yeah, and 2 points. First point with related to Cambodia, that the U.S. bombing and destabilization of Cambodia created the Khmer Rouge, empowered them, and it destroyed the moral fabric of society, and it led to desire for vengeance against the forces that had allowed the U.S. to bomb their country and kill. I mean, the bombing killed tens of thousands of people. It terrified the entire population. And there are also horrific atrocities, like South Vietnamese soldiers that have been mobilized and trained by the United States committed all kinds of grotesque atrocities against the Cambodians. And so that climate, fueled the demand for revenge. And actually, the U.S. ended up supporting the Khmer Rouge because Vietnam invaded Cambodia to liberate the country from the Khmer Rouge. And the CIA hated the Vietnamese and various administrations and wanted to, because Vietnam had defeated America and humiliated America, they wanted revenge against Vietnam. So they ended up supporting the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, even after he was expelled into the jungles of Thailand. And I think they had him take up Cambodia's seat in the United Nations after all those atrocities. And then to bring it back to our beginning of our discussion, yeah, it's just like Hollywood and the mainstream media and propaganda, externalizes evil. It's all this evil communist force, and it displaces public attention from the real evil of our ruling elite, as we started the show with the Epstein and these vile characters who lead depraved personal lives and carry out then horrific policies. So the evil really is within us. It's in our elite that is the most decadent and commits among the worst atrocities of any country, probably in world history. So
Yeah, and everything I always say, whatever you see overseas, whether it's germ warfare or whatever, sooner or later it always comes back home and they use it here. Thank you very much, certainly. Everybody, let's not forget. Let's see here. We want to just show everyone one more time the website, and it is called covertactionmagazine.com. And you can see there's all kinds of stuff here. Gaza flotilla, 9/11, a lot of 9/11 stuff there. Chile's 9/11, lots of stuff here. A lot of Einstein, opposed Zionism, Latin America, all kinds of stuff. We've got lots of series here, which includes 9/11, a lot of good stuff on that, political assassinations. So make sure you go to covertactionmagazine.com, where you can find a lot of interesting information, a lot of great historical stuff regarding covert operations, intelligence, and other things. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Certainly appreciate you. Do you guys have a YouTube channel?
Yes. Well, also, I have a new radio show and podcast called Uncontrolled Opposition, and you can find that on my Substack. So.
Okay. There you go. So Jeremy's got a Substack, also an uncontrolled opposition. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you all. As I always say, you see going across the bottom, if you can afford it, whether it's Cash App, Patreon, or Buy Me a Coffee, certainly appreciate anyone who donates. And additionally, even if you can't afford to donate, by the way, also going to scroll across the bottom is my PO box. So if you want to send something snail mail, I don't care, whatever it is, a letter or a card. I think somebody literally sent me some shirts. So you never know. But whatever you want to send, there's my snail mail stuff, PO box. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.